a couple of people. So again, forgive the introduction and background because I repeat it from session to session. But SharePoint Server, again, is the fastest selling product, I think, in Microsoft history, eclipsing any version of Office and any operating system deployment as well. So what's happened is the demand for everything, SharePoint, is off the scale. Demand for training, which is what I do, I'm confirmed booked up until September to just for training in SharePoint. And the demand for resources, especially development resources and server administrator resources, is incredible as well. This is a fantastic technology for you to pick up and specialize in. Very hot topic. So in this final lecture, in my little series, mini-series here, we're going to talk about the Business Data Catalog. This is probably one of the most interesting new technologies in the product, I would have to contend. So again, thank you for putting me up on your billboards all over the city. That was quite interesting experience. Never had a billboard before. So, most importantly, I do teach the Ted Pattison course again, which I feel is the most comprehensive and thorough training for developers on the market. And yes, go to their site. They even have distance learning. I highly recommend you take this course. Again, the investment that you make will pay off many times over in dividends because of the demand for your skills in this area. So let's cover the Business Data Catalog. What is it? We'll look at this thing called the application definition file. This is where you guys come in. And then we'll see how we can apply that definition file to enable business data inside of SharePoint. In this particular lecture, again, we're covering very solidly this area here on business intelligence. Okay, so it's exposing data within the platform, although this can cross areas as well. Okay, so it can tend to cross across the areas, but it's mainly geared towards business intelligence. So what is the Business Data Catalog? What am I talking about? Well, SharePoint Portal Server, the intent of the Business Data Catalog is to expose line of business system information into SharePoint. So, of course, you have lots of information. Maybe you have your employee information somewhere other than the Active Directory. So I've had a case, for example, where they were using PeopleSoft, and there were specific attributes about their employees that they wanted to make available within the SharePoint environment so that they could enable some forms, to fill out some forms, and this was a vacation absence request, and to help and assist in some of the approvals as well, so workflow. So that data resides outside of SharePoint, and it's going to be in some database or available via a web service. So again, that's kind of how we expose the PeopleSoft data, is someone wrote a web service to front end the data. And then what Business Data Catalog can do is we can connect via ADO.net, so a database, or a web service, and then bring that external information inside of SharePoint. So the first time I heard about this, as I was learning about this, I thought, what's the big deal with Business Data Catalog? I'm a developer. You'll probably write a web part in about 15 minutes that would use some data-bound control and ADO.net or call a web service or through Ajax or whatever. I could probably get that data and bring it into SharePoint. So what's the big deal? So what I'd like you to do is consider that as I finish this lecture. See if somewhere along the line I sort of went, aha, I get Business Data Catalog. This is a very important technology. And see if you can recognize that with me, why it's much more than just simply getting the data. And that has to do with the next point. Very tight integration with SharePoint Server 2007. It enables a very strong, very strong user self-service capability. Again, that's what SharePoint's about, is enabling that end user to be able to work with their data and configure their product and configure their portal without needing, well, us, the developers and the server administrators. I'll mention it now before you even ask me a question. Bringing the data in is read-only. It should, and always will be, I hope, read-only. It's only for bringing data in, not pushing data back. Updating data is not the domain of the SharePoint system. That's the domain of your service-oriented architecture, or at the very least, the application that's looking after your customer information. It's that application that has all the business rules and all the data validation, right? We don't want to create yet another way to update data. So we want to push data to those other applications in different ways, not the business data catalog. Okay. So we have the business data catalog. I'll take questions. I prefer to take questions after, if that's okay. I prefer, but I'll take one now, but I prefer to take the questions afterwards. Yep. That's not quite what I meant. He's talking about self-service capabilities. What I think I should do is go through the lecture and then come back to see if I've answered your question. And if not, we'll take it in contact.
Secondly, when you said that data is read-only, which you can be pulled, business data catalog is read-only. How about the security problem? If you're going to cover it, it's okay.
We'll cover it. Yeah. Okay, so he's talking about the security aspects of that data, which we'll cover as well. All right, so we're going to talk very soon about this thing called the application definition file. And it's a metadata file that describes the data source. Unfortunately, to some unfortunate extent, it's yet another XML data descriptive format that we use to describe data. Do we need another one? Probably not, but it is very specific in its metadata format for exposing the data to SharePoint. But here is where I started to go, oh, I see that this is a little bit more than just displaying data in a web part. Well, first off, it provides a lot of very functional, out-of-the-box business data web parts. So I got a whole section of web parts that operate with this business data and give me some very interesting capabilities out of the box. I can have that data participate in SharePoint lists. So I can integrate my external data with my internal data in SharePoint. I can define the business data catalog data source as a search content source. So I can actually fully index that data source and have it just participate as part of search. I can map those properties that I exposed from that external system into my user profile. So, for example, I'll come back to that situation I ran across. If I'm going to request some vacation time, then an important attribute is how many vacation days entitlement do I have currently? And that was in that external system. So what we did was we used a web service to expose the information, and we used the business data catalog to map a user profile property, number of days vacation entitlement, to that external system, so that we were able directly from the user profile to have that information available to us as we were doing our workflow. And then the other part is you could program against that data source, so we can use it as a source of data within our C# program, or VB.NET program, sorry, .NET program. Just wanted to mention that this business data catalog is part of the enterprise features of Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. So again, we have the basic Windows SharePoint services. Then we have Microsoft Office Standard Edition. And then we have Microsoft Office SharePoint Server Enterprise Edition. And the Enterprise Edition brings to the table the business data catalog, the info path form services, and Excel services. Those are the three key pieces of the enterprise license. So in order to do this, you need the enterprise version of SharePoint. The central administration console, when you install either MOS, Standard, or Enterprise, introduces the shared service provider, so that's an additional administration piece. And I just wanted to mention that if we want to configure the business data catalog, It is part of the shared service provider of the central administration. Okay? So let's look at an application, the components of an application definition file. And so I'll just get out some of the concepts. And then we'll look at how an administrator would import that, how we can configure that to some extent. And then we'll head into SharePoint. We'll actually start using the information. So I have, the screen here. That's not a very, I have to resize this. Just a minute. Just have to resize my window here. File into Visual Studio because I think it'll be a little easier at least to read it. Okay, yeah, it's a little more usable. Okay, it's an XML file, and well, the first thing I'll say is that there are tools that are used to create and edit this. I'm just going to show you the raw source file for now. There is a very basic tool in the Office Server SDK. That's one you could use. And I'll go out in a minute to the internet and just show you a brief demo on a tool called BDC MetaMan. It's a commercial tool from a third party, and I don't know, they charge $1,000, $1,500 for this license to edit these files. But I guess that very smart person recognized that there was a deficiency in tools to be able to actually create and edit these application definition files, and he took advantage of that. So he has a very good tool to edit it, but it's a commercial one and you'd have to purchase it. You either use the basic one, or maybe we're doing this by hand, I don't know. But anyways, so the story is a bit rough on creating these, but again, the tools are out there. So the first thing that we have is this section called Line of Business System Instances. I found the name intriguing. I'm wondering where they're going with this in the future, to be honest. But right now, you can only define one. Okay, so we can only have one connection per business data catalog application definition. And so the line of business system instance, if you look at it, in this case, it's using a SQL connection string to go after the AdventureWorks database, the ubiquitous sample database for Microsoft. So in this particular case, the properties turn out to be things like, the data source, the initial catalog, use of integrated security. If you have any questions on how to authenticate against your particular data source, that's kind of the out of scope of this talk, but there's single sign-on, for example. There are a lot of samples online for line of business system instances in various connection scenarios to different systems. So then what we do is we come down and we start defining a bunch of entities. And you'll see that, yes, that looks a lot like a mapping to the tables in the database, and that is effectively what it is. It can be different. I find this example rather unimaginative because I could think that I could probably do a better job than just simply a one-to-one mapping to the database, but we'll take it this way. So the one thing that it does is we have the identifier section, and that quite simply is the primary key. So we have to name the primary key for that particular table or that particular entity. So the product key is the primary key or identifier of the product table. That's very important because there's going to be, let's see if I can at least find the reference to it here. I'll just mention it here and I'll just tell you what that are. There's two very important things to define within this application definition. Something called a finder instance. So here I see the product finder instance. That is going to return to me, the intent of the product finder is to return a set of values, a row set of values, rows and columns. Then later on, we'll see mention of a product-specific finder. The specific finder's purpose is to take the primary key and return back to me the values, all the values for one single row. Okay? So the finder is geared towards returning rows and columns from a query. And then the specific finder is meant to take the identifier and return one specific row. Okay, so we have those concepts. Now, in order to get the products, what we do is we provide the command text to do so. Okay, so here, kind of buried up in here, is the actual select string that I'm doing from product. And it feeds in a bunch of parameters, which are going to be my query parameters. Okay, so we got max key, product name like English product name, description. Okay, so we formulate the query to return our row set, and it will include with it parameters such that I can define query criteria. And then I define the filters, which again are the query criteria. And what it does is it says that I can do a comparison against the key value, or I can do a wildcard against the name. Okay, just as an example. So I define my parameters, I define my filter, my query criteria, I define my primary key. I need to define the attributes of my product finder and my product specific finder. Then I'll get into a section here finally where, hang on, getting into it here. Okay, so I'm defining a field called name, and the field here is going to be English product name. Okay, so that's the field on the database, and then I'm calling it name. And it's a value system.string. Notice the locale ID. 1033 just means English US. It's the locale for English US. So what I have the capability to do within this file is to map a specific field on the database in the product table to localized names. So I could provide in here the multiple localized display names for English and French and German and Spanish and everything else. Okay, so here I'm defining all of my fields. So here's the key field. This one's system.string. Here's a Boolean value. Another string. It's not very interesting. List price is system.decimal. So I'm just defining all of the fields that are coming back in my return set. Okay. So that goes on and on and on because I have multiple tables here and I have all this description. Finally, down here, one thing I can show you is a section of associations. And here we can see an association between the product table and the product subcategory, and then the product category and product subcategory. These are simply the relationships that exist between the tables, okay, based on their keys. Okay, so I have, again, this XML syntax I can use to fully describe my data source that's understood by this technology called the Business Data Catalog. If I have time later, I'll run their quick little web demo on BDC MetaMan, but that would be your tool for editing this. The tool very much looks like any entity relationship diagramming tool or database diagramming tool. I can kind of draw the tables and I can draw the relationships between them, and I can make all these specifications and definitions in sort of that style of tool. So again, in the slides, just to note that what I do in the slides is I just try and take a few key screenshots just so that you have something to take away here in terms of a reminder of what we talked about. So there's the application definition file. And then the next thing I do is you, the developer, would create that, and then you can hand that over to the administrator. And then it's up to the administrator and central administration to import and configure that. So if I come off to the shared service provider, under Business Data Catalog, I could import an application definition. I've already done so. It's not very interesting. I literally just point to the XML file I created, and it says, okay, it's loaded. It's not very interesting. So once it's loaded, I'm here, and it actually, the central administration provides a pretty good view of exactly what we've created. In fact, better than some of the basic tools. So for example, the first thing I see in my application definition are all of the entities that are defined. So that's good. Here's the list of entities, tables. I can go into product specifically, and I can see all of the details. So we saw as we were trolling through the XML, remember that we saw a list price that was system.decimal, descriptions that were system.string. Not too much that's interesting, but here are the fields that we had exposed from that external data source. Also down here, I can see the relationship defined, that there is a relationships to product category and subcategory. The filter section defines, again, the query criteria that I had exposed, so that what you're going to see very shortly is that by just dropping this definition into one of the business data web parts, I'm able to start submitting query criteria and executing queries. And that's based on these criteria defined here. So I can do a wildcard against the description, a comparison against the key, and a wildcard against the name. So we have a name, a description, and a key we can search. By default, it gives me a view profile action. So what does that mean? Eventually, when I execute my query, I'm going to get back a row set of data. And what I'm able to do is highlight one of the rows of data and execute a view profile. That view profile will return a pre-configured page for me that has all of the field name and value pairs for all of the rows defined, or all of the columns defined in the data set. So what it's doing is it's first executing the Finder instance in order to return my row set. And then when I click on View Profile, it is very simply executing the specific Finder index and then showing me all the results on a pre-configured page. But what I can do is I can actually add actions into here, and you'll see where they're going to come up. And so while the business data catalog cannot update the product information, what you can do is define an action to take the person to the correct place such that they could edit the product information. And so I'll show you how that could possibly be done. I'm going to add an action here. And the action name could be edit product. And we navigate to a URL, so take them to the place they need to go. So for example, this could be HTTP my order system, and then provide the parameters, probably order.aspx, and then you'd be providing parameters like the key equals whatever. I can launch that in a new window, and I can actually add parameters to the query string. So if I need to give them what would make sense, the product key, for example, I can add that as one of the parameters, 0. So what I would do is I could say key equals parameter 0. And I'll demonstrate shortly that it will fill in the correct parameter according to the row I picked. And it will take me to the ordering system that will read the query string and bring up the right product page for me. So I'll just give that an icon. And I'll leave it at that. I defined another one here. Like obviously that one won't work because I don't have an order system here. But the other interesting one I did was a Google search. So I fed in the description as the parameter, and again, just executed a Google search. So we can see that one working. Okay, so I have my full application definition now. Okay, so I've defined it. This is a list of the entities. And then for a specific entity product, I can see the fields. I can see the relationships, the actions, and the filters, which are the query criteria. So now the server administrator's job is done in terms of importing and configuring. It is now time for the end user, the site administrator, to start using this data within their SharePoint site. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw some of the web parts on the home page here and start making use of the data that's available to me. So I'm going to edit the page, and I'm going to add a web part. And there's a whole section here in business data. I'll start it with a simple one, the business data list. And to get started with business data, it's pretty easy. I'm going to configure the web part. And the web part lets me choose one of the predefined lists. So here it is. Here's AdventureWorks, the application I defined. And here's all the quote-unquote tables. So I'll do product. And that's really all there is to it. Oh, I didn't say okay. I do that all the time. So I come here, pick product. I have to click OK here to set the value. And they're off. They're off and running. They're able to query this data source in an effective manner. So I can say the key is equal to, so I see my query criteria show up here. Name, description. So I can say name contains, this is AdventureWorks, so bike, and retrieve the data. Now I can configure this quite a bit. Like I can alter, I can go in and I can alter the columns that are visible and make some changes. But this is just kind of what comes naturally out of the box. But notice that when I highlight the actual product, it gives me this drop-down list. And that drop-down list are the actions that I had configured when I was in the application definition in central administration. So for example, the view profile will execute that thing called the specific finder and return to me a pre-configured page that shows all the field name value pairs. So there you go. And that page as well also gives me access to the other actions that were available. The edit product won't do anything because that was a fictitious link, but I'll do the Google search. So I had chosen the product all-purpose bike stand, and so I just fed it in as a query parameter to the Google search, and I can fire up another page and do a Google search on the product within there. So let's work with a couple of the other web parts. Okay, so I'm going to edit the page. I'm going to get rid of this one. And I'm still going to add a business data list, but I'll show you how very differently it can look. So I'm going to add a business data list here. I'm going to have it be the product category. And I will say, I'll say OK to that because I'm just going to configure it for a moment. So I can edit the view. And I want to, in this particular case, I want to retrieve all items. And I don't want to allow the user to change the criteria. So I can come in and configure this to work exactly the way I want. I'm not gonna limit the values. The only, this one's simple with a key and name, but I don't care about the key. I'm just going to display the name. And I also have sort and filter criteria. So if I wanted to automatically limit it to something, I have the option to enter sort and filter criteria right within this part. Oh, and then the other thing I want to do is remove the actions menu. So hang on one sec. Edit page. Modify the shared web part. That's in here. I'm just going to take off the toolbar. Okay, so I just want to look at that for a second. So this is the same business data list, but what I've done is I've removed all the ability to query it, and I've returned all of the categories statically here as a display. Okay, so very different kind of business data list. But I'm going to make it much more interesting. So I'm going to add another web part here, which is called a business data related list. So now what it's going to do is take advantage of the associations that I've defined between the different tables. I'm going to do the, oh, I have to move it. I'll move it down, makes more sense. I'm going to configure the related data as product subcategory. So notice the choice here even limits me. It's already smart enough to know which pieces this is associated with, so it's limiting my choice. I'm going to pick product subcategory. I'm going to OK this just for a sec. I'm going to edit the view, retrieve all items, no limit, display the name. Okay, that's all I need to do with this. Say OK. I just want to come in, oh, sorry, it took me out of edit page mode. I'm going to modify the shared web part. I'm going to take off the toolbar. Okay, so far so good. But now you'll see it's not hooked up to anything. It's saying, I'm looking for you to connect me to something that can provide me a product category. So here is an attribute of web parts, which I find fascinating, and that is the connection points. You can define connection points as I'm developing web parts, and I can effectively pass data. I define them via interfaces, and I can pass data back and forth between web parts with the same defined interface. In this particular case, with business data, it says I can get the related data from product list or product category list in this instance. By the way, it doesn't matter which way you connect up the web parts, whether I connect part B to A or A to B, it's the same thing. The connection points here say, why don't I can send the data, somewhere. It may or may not be useful to you. I could continue this exercise, but so for example, I could get rid of this, make this a business data related list, and kind of do the same thing, right? Hook it up to this, so that what I could do is provide a drill down capability. I choose the category, I choose the subcategory, and then this would populate with the products in that subcategory. So again, pretty good stuff, like out of the box for just having an application definition file. They can create a pretty interesting and useful page to navigate through the information. Okay, so again, in the slides, I just try and provide a recap and some screenshots for you to take away. So the idea was that I edit a web part page, and there's a section of business data web parts, and the particular ones I was using was business data list and business data related list, and put those on there. I configured them with the available tables that I got off the dialogues, and showed you this, executed a query for bike, showed you the how I configured additional web parts and business data related lists, using the connections attribute to connect the two parts together to provide the drill down capability. And then having configured it, that was just showing you how the drill down was working. And then finally, the actions are available to me on the drop-down menu after query, and the view profile is the one you get out of the box, and then I added a couple of actions to do an edit in a Google search. Okay, so Where else can we use business data? I'll just go in and show you a couple of other spots that we can incorporate the business data into our applications. One spot is in lists. So I'm going to go off to this document library, and what I'm going to do is, for example, maybe I'm creating some type of product specifications. So what I want to do is I want to associate it with the product, but that product is coming from the business data catalog. So what I do is I head into the document library settings, and I can simply create a column like I've done in my earlier lectures. I can just create custom columns for any of my lists. And one of the choices that I have here is business data. So I can choose a particular business data item as one of my columns. And I'm going to choose, so I have to choose the same thing. I have to choose the table, so it's product. And display the actions menu. I'll leave that on, but see, I have that choice. I can turn it off. Link the column to the profile page. And then, this is interesting, I can add other columns from the business data to show in my list as well. So if I wanted to show the name and the list price, for example. Okay, so I'll add that data in there. Oh, I must specify a name. That makes sense, right? Product. Okay, so I'll add that to my list. So let's go use it. So now that I see 3 new columns have shown up, got product, product list price, and product name. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the properties of this. And you'll see that now I actually have a product line here. And it uses the same sort of interface to provide me the query criteria so I can find my product. So I can say description, I can say bike, I can execute the query, I can choose the hitch rack, and there I've selected it and set it, and now it will display those information in those columns. Noted that I chose to have the actions menu available. So if I wanted to do a view profile or edit the product or Google search, I could do it from here. I could turn that off. And notice very carefully here the refresh button. Because I might have 1 million list items, that data gets cached with your list item, all right? So when you select it, it will take a cached value and store it with your list item. Why? Because if I have 1 million items in my list, that would take years to load because I can't sit there and execute the singular query for each and every line item every time I want to view my list, right? So if I do need the most up-to-date information because the list price changed, then I have the option to refresh it here. That will execute the business data catalog queries to refresh the data. Okay, other places I could use this. Okay, so I have to go into central administration. I mentioned the user profiles. I mean, we didn't cover this in any of the lectures, but the user profiles is essentially all the properties as synchronized with Active Directory in the majority of cases. And so, for example, the properties, I'll just view a user profile just to show you the one here. I'll edit this one. So it provides me an interface to show and potentially update all of the properties here. So there's my picture and some stuff about me and my skill sets and all that other stuff. So the idea would be I need to add a property to what I get out of the box here. So down here in user profile properties, I can add one. And for example, it doesn't have to be linked to anything. I could just provide a cooking club attribute. Same cooking club. So I could provide it, and I could make that a Boolean value. Click here to join the cooking club. So I'll just define one attribute just to show you about defining the attributes in the user profile. The policy setting, I could make it optional or required. I'll make it optional. And the privacy settings, I'll default it to everyone, so I can also set a privacy level. And then I can also set whether the user can actually override the privacy setting and whether they can actually edit the value. So I'm saying yes to all that. The user's in full control. Okay. So if I now look at my user profile, this idea of, I'm just getting across this idea of adding a property first. Then here, I've defined something completely down here, cooking club. Click here to join the cooking club. I can modify the privacy to only my colleagues, for example. So, I can go ahead and define my own attributes in the user profile database. So if I'm going back to do that again, so if I go to add a profile property, I don't really have a good example here, but that would be a very dumb example. But I'm not going to attempt to hook this up. I'll just kind of demonstrate the concept. Make it, optional is fine. Everyone. Override. It's down here. So the data source connection, property import mapping. Hang on. Why don't I have it here? Oh, geez. Oh, I had to go somewhere else. Sorry to configure this. But basically, what I would want to have happen here is I just have to configure it more. Sorry, I didn't have it set up for demonstration. But my data source connection could be my business data catalog, and then I would choose the field that I want to map. Again, the actual case I had in mind was the fact that we had created a web service to pull additional employee information from PeopleSoft, and we did that via the business data catalog, and we mapped a couple of those properties by adding them exactly this way. Okay, so we mapped the properties and we can add them. The other place that I can go is in shared services. In search, just to describe enterprise search, by the way, and this is an enterprise search. So, by the way, it doesn't just search SharePoint sites. I can actually point search at a file share. So I can index all documents on file shares. I can point it at Exchange public folders. I can point it at regular websites, just plain HTML or ASP or ASP.NET websites, and it will crawl content as well. People are interested. There is a specific, a product SKU just for search server, because people are interested in just the enterprise search, not the one that's bundled with SharePoint. But the one that's bundled with SharePoint is the enterprise search. So a question I usually got was, do I have to, if I buy Moss, do I have to buy the enterprise search? No, that's just provided as a separate SKU in case that's all you want. Okay, so the other thing that I can tie into the search, the fifth thing I can tie in, is the business data catalog data. So I can define a content source, and I can say new content source, product data, and again, I can target business data, and I can configure it for a full crawl. So here, crawl the selected application, AdventureWorks, and define the crawl schedule for it. So there's a couple other places that I can incorporate my data, and again, it's very powerful and makes it fully searchable. Okay, back to the slides. Okay, business data in lists, so I can incorporate it as part of lists. So I just define a new column. I say it's business data. I can provide the default column that's mapped to it, and I include some of the other columns along with it. And remember that when it's part of a list, it's static, and that's by design. Okay, and then what it does is it provides me the search facility so that I can actually search for and link to the correct product. I also showed you that it's possible to extend user profile properties by mapping them to the business data catalog, and also making it a search content source so that it will actually be crawled on a schedule. So that was the other BDC integration points. Finally, I have a very short demonstration just showing you that I can actually programmatically through C# actually get into the application definition and start executing the methods and getting back to properties. Okay. So here's my little, oh, sorry, that was the thing. Here's my tiny little program here. It's just a console application that will, we can sort of debug step by step here just to show you the different things firing off. But the application definition AdventureWorks is part of a shared service provider. So in code, the first thing that we need to get a reference to is the shared service provider. So here it is, shared service provider to use. Happens to be the name of it was Litware SSP, shared service provider. That's the name. And then the next wording is a line of business system instance, right? We need a line of business system instance. Okay, so what it's doing is it's getting the enumeration for the line of business system instances for the application. And remember today, the reality is it's only one. So it's kind of funny that you have to get a collection of instances and then you only have one anyway. So now that I have the collection of instances, I want the application that is AdventureWorks. So I'm kind of just getting a reference to that application definition file. Good, so far so good. So now that I have the application definition file, I can get at everything else. So for example, I want to get at the entity product. So I pull up the product. And then just as a small little trivial example, I do a console.writeLine that just shows me the entity name for product, which will be product. So again, it's a trivial example, but I can access the properties of that entity. And then I can actually execute the methods. So here I'm feeding in the primary key, the product key of 486. And what I can do is, remember I have that thing called find specific finder and finder. And what it wants is the primary key. So I feed it in the primary key and also the application I want to execute against, which is AdventureWorks. And then, again, very trivially, I'm just printing out the product key to the console just to prove that I actually got reference to it. So I will, I'll just debug at the end here just to show you the console window. Again, it's a very, very trivial from the output perspective. So I'll just increase the font here so you can see it. Make it really big, 36, just so you can see entity name product. And did I have another breakpoint there? Oh, I put it on the end there. So just F10 over that. And C is just showing that I actually traversed through the application instance, found the entity, executed specific finder, and got a property off of it. So I'm actually done early, interestingly enough. So that was, again, I just kind of pasted in some of the key code. Sorry, it kind of cut off there. just shows you some of the key code that went to exercise the application definition file. And again, simply want to encourage you, we really treasure those evaluations. So please, if you could fill those out with your comments, us, the speakers, are definitely looking for your feedback on what you enjoyed, what we can improve. And we thank you very much for coming today and the conference. And now I can take any questions that you might have. Right here.
Suppose you want to personalize the data. Suppose you're showing data to a sales representative and you only want to show data from his region, the region which he covers. Can you do that stuff with the web paths, or can you extend the existing web paths?
Yes, I mean, I think that the trick would just be to ensure that if you want to filter the data that way, sorry, because he didn't have a microphone. He was just looking to see if he could personalize the information. For example, just the data from this person's region or something like that. The trick, the simple trick is that you must make sure that what you want to filter by is an actual filtered descriptor. So you want to make sure that you include a region parameter or a whatever other type of filter you're looking for. And then, I don't know if you caught it in the web parts, the web parts actually let you specify some of the criteria and filters for display of the web part. And if I have to, you could exercise those programmatically as well. So,
can you extend the web parts? Like, there may be scenarios where it's from the finance sector and you want to show the numbers associated, the figures, the actual dollar value of your order. But to other people, you don't want to show the dollar values associated. So it's like the use of data depending on the permission or the hierarchy of the...
Yeah, I'll get back to permissions. I did realize I forgot to mention that while I was there. I mean, you're actually talking more about, he's talking more now about an application scenario. So how would I do this, this, and this? It's a possible combination of things. Like I could be using some of the data web parts, some of the business data web parts, some of the connection points, and some of the filter web parts. Some combination of that might do the job for you. But if you don't, I mean, the general story about those web parts out of the box is the configuration is limited to what you can do with them out of the box. So beyond that, you might be into a customization scenario. I don't know.
Like, can I inherit from these web parts and add actual
no.
to it and kind of...
No, they're not inheritable entities, unless someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not inheritable entities. I mean, they're kind of closed systems. So I would need to create something on my own at that point. Just want to mention the security. It's possible to lock down the permissions of it, but they're fairly generic. The other way I can limit information is I could actually integrate with the user's credentials. So I can impersonate the user. And if the system is set up to do so, then on the back end, like the web service, you could take the user's credential and deal with the filtering aspect yourself. That's one possible way. Or perhaps the system itself already reacts to who is the user and what can they see, and then we could do the impersonation scenario.
But then the caching doesn't apply, right?
Hang on one sec. Yep.
Is it possible to send the hidden parameters such as SharePoint's login ID, login credentials to the database?
It's also possible to use like a service account. I can use integrated security, in which case the application pool identity will be used against the data source. And that would also mean that you'd have to integrate the application pool identity with the database and control the query that way. But now it's generic, right? Everybody would have the same access to data. That might be appropriate in some scenarios. It might be appropriate to use the user's credential. I don't know the answer to that.
It's based on some organizational history is there. Some reporting structures or some kind of information is there with them. Those kind of information is a role-based area. Is it possible
It is, but it takes some a little bit of chaining and configuration. So not like out of the box, but I would start with, the user profile is also available as a web service, by the way. That's one of the web services available. So I use that all the time to go get the user's attributes, and I can find out who their manager is. And so I get all of these dynamic attributes about the user and the region they're in and who their manager is. And then I use that to execute a business data query, for example, to get back the specific information. So again, the trick is to make sure that all the criteria you want are parameters of the business data catalog definition. And then, so yes, kind of off to the side, I have to get those criteria and then feed them into that. But there are ways to then use other web parts.
Filter web parts. Can we turn these mics on because the battery just went on this?
Hello. Hello, hello. Okay, good. No problem. I can finish up here. So again, always the trick is to make sure that any of the parameters that you need are part of the filter criteria of the application definition. Is there another one of these? This mic is going, okay, I got it now. It's all right. So just make sure it's part of the filter criteria, and then you can use other web parts to set the filter criteria for the queries in business data.
If you're sending, like, you mentioned you can send it to the web services and that can kind of churn the data for the permissions there. But then you are not using the BDC catalog caching or things like that.
Oh, no, sorry. What I meant was the application definition. One of the possible things I can connect the BDC to is a web service. All I'm saying is that it's the programming of your web service. I'm still talking about accessing it through the BDC, but if it has a web service interface, you're just in much more programmatic control of what's getting returned.
Always needs to go to the web services, get the data real time.
It's real time most of the time.
You know,
It does not cache.
then it doesn't cache, and it kind of then burdens my, like if I have a PeopleSoft application or something,
Oh yeah,
it will burden my application.
absolutely it will. Here's what a lot of people do. It's the classic thing, even when you're doing a lot of querying or reporting against line of business systems, what do people do? They create a replica. They create a replica database that can be queried all you want and it won't affect your line of business system. You're absolutely correct. You must absolutely watch what you're doing because you're adding a lot of query burden to that system. But it's done in real time. So every time I hit that home page, so I wouldn't put a lot of business data catalog parts on my home page because every time someone logs in, it's going to execute 15 queries. So okay, I'll take. Well, can you? I'm not sure what you mean. You asked about info path forms and BDC. As I said, once we've got the business data integrated into SharePoint, then anywhere else I can include it as a source of information. So if I needed to select a product from an info path form, that would be possible too. Yeah.
So, spoke about business data, this information being indexed.
Yes.
That is, can be searched very easily. I didn't get that down.
Oh, would have been better through demonstration. Again, if I had more time, I could have configured it, but it will just basically index all of the product information to make it searchable. So if I want a quick search, I don't know, a quick search of my product information, then I could simply index the data and use the out-of-the-box search.
Go to the application and taking the information and then getting it back. Is it doing some sort of cache and putting it somewhere?
Well, yes, it's the cache in this case is simply the index of the search server. So it's indexing all of the data. And so the advantage of that is that it's integrated. So it's not just the product information, but if I have all my documents on the products and all the people who manage the products, I could tie all of this together so I could bring all the information to one place. So it's the integration that's more the compelling reason for indexing that data as part of search, because I already have the query capabilities. Okay, I've reached my time limit. So just a couple of things. So number one is I got a couple more of these things. So I'll toss one this way. Toss one that way. Well, you guys can probably get that. I have left here one lone Harley Davidson flag. Here. No, not you, sorry.
For you.
It's employees don't count. So you know what? He was anxiously raising his hand. So you don't have one. So congratulate this gentleman here on receiving my last Harley Davidson. Okay, well, that's my last lecture for the, and I hope to see you back here next year, including you as a delegate to the conference. So thanks again very much. If anyone else has any questions, I can definitely take them offline here. Thanks again. Take care.